Oh, good afternoon. And we are continuing our series of the Montague Barker Lecture Series on creation care. And we're very pleased to have Mark Num speaking to us this afternoon. And the title of his talk is East Asian Theology as a Corrective to a Western View of Creation Care. Mark is a British-born Chinese Anglican priest in the Diocese of Bristol and founder of the Tea House, which increases visibility and participation of Chinese heritage clergy in the Church of England. He is a member of the Campaign Against Racism group, who work with the government to combat hate crime against East and South Asian communities. Prior to ordination, Mark was a pastor in Hong Kong for 10 years. His MA dissertation was titled, What the Church of England Can Learn from East Asian Theology in Terms of Contextualizing the Gospel. He has taught at Trinity College and Emmanuel College. Mark is a regular contributor to BBC Radio, UCB Radio, the Church Times, and has written for Preach Magazine. Mark can be found on Facebook and Twitter as at Mark Nam, with no break between Mark and Nam. And with that, I turn it over to Mark. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right, wonderful. Just get this message off the screen. It's appeared. All right, good morning. Afternoon. It's morning somewhere. Thank you for that warm welcome, Tom. As you said, my name is Mark Yan Ying Sum Nam, and I'm just trying to get this to work. Here we go. And I just realized, because Tom asked me my last name over lunch, my last name Nam isn't a typically Chinese surname. What happened when my great-grandfather came across to the UK, he introduced himself in the usual Chinese manner, which is to introduce yourself by your family name first, because family comes first. And so his given name, which was said second, became our surname. And so already my family's history was one of being mixed up and misunderstood. And really, this talk is a bit about untangling that mess, trying to work out both my Chinese and my Western identity. And my hope is that from those reflections, it might inspire you in terms of how to look at issues of creation care from a particular point of view, that being East Asian. As Tom said, I run a group called the Tea House, which again seeks to raise the visibility and the voices and perspectives of groups like East Asians. And my thoughts today come from more of a practical, contextual perspective, and I hope it adds to the wonderful sessions you've already been enjoying as part of the Montague Barker lecture series. So, in the spring of 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa, Tenzing Norgay, were the first men to climb to the top of Mount Everest. The world celebrated this incredible achievement, and newspapers in the West proclaimed, "Man conquers mountain." And since then, humankind has continued to conquer nature. Here's a photo of Everest today. We've also managed to conquer the seas, our forests, and even space. Veni, vidi, vici. We came, we saw, we conquered. And as you'll be aware, for the past number of years, we have seen an increased awareness of ecological issues and humankind's impact on creation. And as a Church of England minister, I am acutely aware of our need to offer a theologically robust and uniquely Christian approach to these issues in our churches, on the ground, in our communities. And so the question I want to ask for the next part is whether stewardship, and you would have come across this term no doubt, or the idea of stewardship provides the best approach. Now, the day after Stephen Cottrell was named the 98th Archbishop of York, I tuned into Radio 4 to hear him being interviewed about his appointment. Bishop Stephen highlighted three areas of concern: one of which was how to live sustainably on the earth. And the interviewer asked what living sustainably means, to which Bishop Stephen replied, it means being effective stewards, so there's that word, of God's creation. Now, according to R.J. Berry, the editor of this book, Environmental Stewardship, Critical Perspectives, Past and Present, stewardship is the default position within ordinary Christian groups, the default. But why is this? We need to ask why. Well, it's widely accepted that the term gathered momentum following the publication of Lynn White Jr.'s article in 1967 called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And in this article, White argues that the Christian worldview, as it developed in Western Christianity, legitimized and encouraged humanity's domination and exploitation of nature. And by paying particular attention to the use of the word dominion in Genesis 1, 26 to 30, and that's the verse where God makes humankind in his image to have dominion over the fish, the birds, etc. White says this. He says, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. He goes on, it not only established a dualism of man and nature, but also insisted that it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. That was in 1967. Now, the most popular defensive strategy in relation to this critique of Genesis 1 has been to interpret dominion as reflective of the idea of stewardship. And many, many academics have adopted this approach over the years, such as Tim Cooper, William Darius, Daniel K. Laggett. These are popular books that have just come out over the last few decades. And their approach takes the language found in Genesis 1 and interprets it within the broader treatment of kingship found in the Old Testament. For example, the words have dominion might mean govern or rule in the sense of Solomon's peaceful rule, and stewardship in 1 Kings 4, for example. Others look to Deuteronomy chapter 17, 14 to 20, which describes kingly rule as that of a brother over a fellow sibling. In other words, interpreting the word dominion as how a brother or sister rules over others in the family, with the ultimate example being found in Christ's kingly rule over creation. Now, it doesn't require too much imagination to see how this type of interpretation fuels the colonial project in terms of how lording over and the dualism between man and nature has led to the catastrophic exploitation of land, animals, and fellow humanity. I'm sure you can appreciate how problematic that might be. And yet this very interpretation of stewardship has become, and to quote David G. Horrell, a central plank in many attempts to construct a biblical environmental ethic. And this is certainly the case I have found for the Church of England, of which I am part, as demonstrated by the 2005 report Sharing God's Planet, which stated, God created the universe. Human beings can only hope to adapt it. The human role is defined as steward of creation, exercising dominion under God. You can see the express link there between stewardship and dominion, whose rule is sovereign. Dominion is an exercise of vice-regency, lordship under God. And then it says this, the biblical term for humanity's relationship with creation is steward. A steward is a servant who relates to God on behalf of who he or she exercises dominion. And this notion has been embraced to such an extent that it has led to a realignment of major evangelical leaders and bodies behind a more environmentally conscious vision of Christian responsibility, as evidenced when Bishop Stephen mentioned it on Radio 4 last year. So stewardship, it seems, is here to stay. Unfortunately, this presents us with a problem. In Renewing the Face of the Earth, David John Atkinson points out that the term stewardship is never used in the Bible in relation to creation, which rather interestingly contradicts what the C of E report just said. And despite the assumed biblical model of the relationship between king and people, Horrell argues that stretching it to encompass creation is a distortion of the text. So it's all a bit concerning, isn't it? And another academic who challenges the notion of stewardship is Richard Bauckham. In his excellent book, Bible and Ecology, Rediscovering the Community of Creation, Bauckham stresses the danger of overestimating one's power to achieve or control things. And when he refers to James Lovelock's book, The Revenge of Gaia, Why the Earth is Fighting Back, Bauckham argues, and I like this, that if the Earth is a self-regulating system, then stewardship is a hubristic attempt to do what Gaia, or creation, can do much better. And the same argument is very well put by Claire Palmer, who says, to be a successful steward, either in the feudal or financial sense, it is necessary to understand what is being controlled. But the natural world is not like an estate, nor like money in this respect. It is composed of complex ecosystems and atmospheric conditions that we do not understand and cannot predict. And given these severe criticisms and shortcomings of stewardship as an environmental ethic, I agree with Paulus Gregarios when he writes, replacing the concept of domination with the concept of stewardship will not lead us very far. For even in the latter, there lies a hidden possibility of the objectification and alienation, which are the root causes of the sickness of our civilization. We would still be reducing nature to nothing but, that is, nothing but an object given into our hands for safekeeping and good, or I would argue bad, management. And this brings us back full circle to the problem that Lynn White Jr. pointed out at the beginning, namely that dominion, or as we have seen, stewardship, not only establishes a dualism of man and nature, but also insists that it's God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. So, is there an alternative word to stewardship that offers a stronger theological approach to creation care and a better explanation of the word dominion? I would like to suggest that there is, and that East Asian culture and perspectives help us, and they offer an alternative lens and a necessary corrective to Western categories of thought. I believe that East Asian attitudes towards creation are inherently more holistic and biblical, thereby opening up new avenues or explorations for reflection and engagement with ecological issues. I believe, when I listen to the current debate in the West, that we have such a paucity of language. I believe East Asian theology will provide more colors to the palette of which we can paint a new future. Now, I have to say, I cannot speak of East Asian attitudes to nature without making some very broad generalizations today. There are many religions and philosophies such as Taoism, Confucianism, Shintoism, different forms of Buddhism, folk religion, Christianity, etc. But generally speaking, in Asian religious traditions, there is a deep sense of kinship between humanity and nature. There is a notable absence of the analytical understanding of nature, which is inherent to stewardship. And instead, humanity's connection to nature is understood relationally, intuitively, mystically, and aesthetically. And in terms of my locatedness, I'm fourth generation British-born Chinese. So my family have been in the UK for over 100 years. And although I've spent over half my life living and working in Asia, I do not bring to you an authentically indigenous, or what is known as grassroots Asian theology. I cannot offer that to you. However, I believe there is much to be said about perspectives arising from the East Asian diaspora, the biggest diaspora in the world, who often see themselves as occupying those liminal spaces in between cultures and generations, and as a result, offer a unique contribution to the exploration of theology. And from this picture, you can see I'm not English, actually. I was born in Wales, So I'm Welsh, and I use this picture to kind of signify my Chinese and Welsh. But as an aside, when we look through the Bible, many of the people who bring a prophetic voice are people born of the diaspora. Now, I'm only going to look at a few examples, given our time, that resonate with someone like me, who embodies both Western and Eastern perspectives and traditions, and then offer just one hermeneutic that I believe draws upon imagery found in the Old Testament, starting right there, but finding its fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ, leading to new creation and, importantly, new language that is preferable to the aforementioned stewardship. So that's our plan. So in his article, it's quite an old article now, called The Yin Yang Way of Thinking, Jun-Young Lee identifies how the either-or style of theological thought, so in Enlightenment thinking, has contributed towards the pollution of our environment. When I mention Western modes of thought, I'm referring generally to patterns of thought that find their origin in Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, whose ultimate focus is on the dichotomy of the forces of good and evil. And as we know, this is enshrined in Aristotelian logic, which became the foundation of Western thought. And this either-or way of theological thinking results in the absolute dogma of God. And the God of dogma is not really God at all. The God who is absolutized in and through our human words is less than the God of Christianity. And it is this Western emphasis on absolute reason from which sometimes the divine cannot even escape. And so Jun-Young Lee argues, he says that Western thinking creates the dichotomy and conflict between man and nature, between body and spirit. Man must either conquer nature or nature will conquer him. Man's conquest of nature is ultimately the conquest of himself. And we see that, don't we? Thus, by this way of thinking, the opposites never come together into a harmonious and peaceful coexistence. And so in response to this problem, Lee suggests adopting yin-yang symbolism as an alternative category of theological thinking. Yin-yang represents a normative worldview for many East Asians, and it finds its origins in Confucianism. And Lee points out that the main difference between Confucianism and Western modes of thought is that Confucianism does not exclude the validity of the middle, unlike Western worldviews that are informed by dualistic absolution. And yin-yang thinking enables the reconciliation of opposing elements, which, as I've said, creates a deep sense of kinship between humanity and nature. And you can see in this diagram the way that they kind of swirl together and coexist. It's a bit like how us Brits like to, stir milk into our tea, a nice coming together of East and West. And it is contended that this reconfiguration of relationships breaks the human nature divide inherent to stewardship and is key to the transformation of hearts and minds towards the environment. Ian C. Bradley surmises in God is Green, Ecology of Christians, that this sense of oneness between humans and the rest of creation is an importive corrective, the idea that man has been put into the world to dominate. And I like this artist's interpretation of how the world's yin-yang, so balance, has been mutilated beyond recognition. It's an artistic kind of image. Due to the breakdown in synergy between humanity and the rest of creation that breaks this harmony. Now, when I refer to Confucianism, and it's very complex, but when I'm referring to it today, I'm not referring to it solely as a religion, per se, but more as a philosophy or a worldview. So please don't worry yourself too much about syncretism at this point. We can have that discussion later. Although I would say that the Western paranoia of other religions, which has plagued much of the Western church, is probably responsible for that paucity of language I talked about and the shortage of symbols we have for engaging with the climate crisis, which is why stewardship remains a central plank. So in terms of environmental ethics, Confucianism refers to the connection between humanity and heaven, suggesting that all aspects of human activity should be ethically based for the creation of a harmonious society. Now, Wan Yangming, a Neo-Confucian scholar, writes this. I like this. He says, the great man, so that would be a morally noble person, regards heaven and earth and the myriad things as one body. He regards the world as one family and the country as one person. Now, as to those who make a cleavage between objects and distinguish between self and others, they are small men, so uncultivated persons. The great man can regard heaven, earth, and the myriad things as one body, is not because he deliberately wants to do so, but because it is natural to the humane nature of his mind that he do so. And when we think about he who is the epitome of true humanity, that would of course be Jesus Christ, who would see the myriad things and everything else as one in himself. So again, you can see how this worldview might inform how humanity can relate to creation in a more holistic, symbiotic, and again, I would argue a biblical way. All right, we're going to have a bit of fun. I said that we'd be looking at East Asian culture. So let's take a leap forward a few thousand years and take an example from modern Japanese pop culture. Now, again, I'm doing this because I am a parish priest and I'm engaging with young people. And if you watch Top of the Pops now, you'll see BTS, a Korean band. You know, I find it amazing when I go into assembly, children look at me and are like, he's cool. I didn't get that growing up. All right, so we're going to look at pop culture. Here we have Final Fantasy VII, a cult, and I really mean a cult classic video game from the 90s, released around the time of the Kyoto Protocols, which is quite suiting. And this is so iconic that it has recently been remade for PlayStation 4 and 5 more than 20 years later. In the minds of young people, this genre-defining RPG, a role-playing game, follows Cloud Strife, there he is in the middle, as he joins an eco-terrorist organization called Extinction Rebellion. Called Avalanche, as they launch a war against the evil Shinra Corporation, who are a global pseudo-governmental conglomerate which derives its power by extracting Mako from the Earth, which is essentially the life force of the planet, okay? And the war begins inside the bustling metropolis of Midgar, a city built on the extraction of Mako through the use of reactors. And the city is divided into two levels, upper and lower, by an immense plate. And the plate provides the foundation for the city infrastructure. Now, listen up. Those who are lucky enough to be part of the city's economic or social elite are rewarded with a relatively peaceful existence above the plate. But those who live below the plate suffer from pollution, poverty, and crime in the city's slums. They are largely ignored or dismissed by the city above. Does this sound familiar? Of course it does. And Final Fantasy VII is as relevant today as it was 20 years ago. The exploration of Gaia mirrors what is happening in our world today. We are both planets facing existential crisis. And without giving any way spoilers, the fate of the planet in this game ultimately depends on the sacrifice of a pure-hearted, part human, part divine being, which very much sounds like a foreshadowing of Christ. And all to say, if you are sensitive or follow Japanese or East Asian pop culture or anime, you'll soon discover the interconnectedness of humans and creation is a reoccurring theme. For years, Studio Ghibli, who are known as the Disney of the East, have been creating stories about living in harmony with creation and the consequences if you don't. A wonderful example of this is the classic Princess Mononoke, a film by legendary director Hayao Miyazaki. I just want to reflect on this a little bit, it'll help us. The film centers around a war over limited resources, not unlike our current economic situation. The humans ignite this conflict by shooting and killing a nature god, so they're disturbing creation. And one of the gods becomes enraged at this and assumes a demonic form. So when you see demonic form, think natural disasters, global warming, etc. And he violently attacks nearby villages. So here we have this irreconcilable divide between humanity and nature. And as we heard from Jun Young Lee's critique of Western dualism, man must either conquer nature or nature will conquer him. Indeed, this leads to many other wars: men against men, humanity against nature, humanity against the gods. A broken world that clearly mirrors our own. Indeed, it mirrors the rupturing we see in Genesis 3, when humankind turns away from God, turns away from one another, turns away from themselves, and of course, turns away from creation. But arriving in the midst of all this chaos is one of our protagonists, Ashitaka. He manages to defeat the violent nature god, but to do so, he must take the curse upon himself and resign himself to death. And mirroring Jesus' journey to the cross, Ashitaka must leave his people and journey to the far west to meet his death to atone for humanity. So these themes really kind of saturate a lot of East Asian fiction and literature. Now, the other characters see nature and humanity as completely divided, different and unable to mix. But Ashitaka does not see the division between them. So to him, all life is sacred. He is able to move between the warring sides. And very interestingly, his otherness is emphasized throughout the film. Because whilst he appears to have otherworldly abilities and insights, he also suffers human hardships, much like Christ. And there's a moving scene where an eco-activist who personifies eco-feminist perspectives on the left is involved in a vicious fight with the leader of humanity, who represents progress on the right. And Ashitaka intervenes and delivers a stirring, I guess it's a sermon, and his curse manifests itself as a black swirling tendrils as he shouts to the shocked and terrified crowd, "This is what hatred looks like. This is what it does when it catches a hold of you." You see, our protagonist's fight is not against humans or nature, but against hatred, against sin and enmity. And it is his willingness to meet violence with love that is his greatest weapon. And although Princess Mononoke is not explicitly religious, it does draw from Shinto mythology and beliefs that reflect many of the tenets of Christianity. Shinto faith stresses relation and connectedness. And this is an important theme that develops throughout the film as the characters gradually acknowledge relationships and move away from Western imposed individualism. They move from a dualistic Western rendering of the world to one that is more integrated. As Christ literally gave a blind man sight, Ashitaka metaphorically opens a people's eyes to the interdependent relationship between humans and nature. In a book called The Geography of Thought, How Asians and Westerners Think Differently, Richard E. Nisbet suggests that the difference in worldviews between China and the West is due to geography. He says, the ancient Greek civilization started in valleys, separated from each other by mountains. Although there are common themes amongst the valley states, each developed an independent valley culture. Chinese civilization, on the other hand, began in the plains around the Yellow River, which gave rise to an interdependent farming culture. And this is because farms further away from the river depended on goodwill and cooperation from the farms next to the river. And so the ancient Chinese, therefore, placed a greater emphasis on consensual collective behavior and the importance of having harmonious relationships, which, as we have seen, was codified by Confucius into a pattern of behavior that became the foundation of Chinese society. So hence we have a situation where, despite a shared humanity between East and West, There are fundamental differences in values, philosophy, culture, and even theology. So what I want to do now, having taken a whistle-stop tour of, East Asian perspectives from ancient history through to modern day, I want to propose an East Asian hermeneutic drawing from some of the concepts that we have explored through looking at Confucianism, Buddhism, Yin-Yang, Shinto, and so on. And the reason I've done this, again, in my context, is when a lot of my congregation engage in matters of creation care, their solutions are very pragmatic, very secular, not really centering around Christ. So this is what we're trying to do, tease out a Christ-centered hermeneutic. Earlier on, I critiqued a number of academics for interpreting dominion and stewardship in Genesis 1 as setting humankind as rulers and above creation. Our starting point is going to be slightly different. Here we have Genesis 2:7, where it says, Adam was created from the dust of the ground, the same ground that the animals were formed from in 2:10. And keeping yin-yang theology in mind, so try and keep that mindset, we can understand this relationship between the human and the soil as symbiotic, akin to that of a gardener, right, and his garden. Now, the inclusion of the word dust is significant when connected to enthronement formulas spoken to Baasha, for example, in 1 Kings 16, verse 2, where it reads, I lifted you up from the dust and made you leader of my people Israel. Okay? Thus, when we see that Adam was raised from the dust of the ground in Genesis, we understand that God grants him a kingly authority over creation. But what does this kingly rule look like? As we've discussed, there are all types of kings, and many of them turn out to be corrupt and domineering. Well, the royal dimension of Adam's role becomes clearer when we understand the context. Throughout the ancient Near Middle East, the mark of a successful king or queen was their ability to make their land productive and fruitful. So in biblical times, one of the king's greatest achievements would be the pleasure gardens, and there's a rendition of one. I don't think they look quite like that, but you get the idea. Was the pleasure gardens that they made modeled on the Garden of Eden, and they normally planted them in the capital cities. This was the mark of a good king. And even now, if you visit palaces in different countries, you'll almost always see incredibly beautiful and manicured gardens. Now, who here would admit to being a member of a national trust? All right? They're splendid, aren't they? As well as being stately homes, they are essentially pleasure gardens demonstrating how well their lords and ladies took care of the land. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the designs take direct inspiration from East Asia. Here's a photo, not from Japan or Korea, but taken at Tatton Park. And here's another one I took last summer at Biddulph Grange Garden, here in the UK. Adam, therefore, was created from the dust of the ground to become a royal, that's the kingly enthronement, a royal gardener. And it's through this lens that we are to understand the nature of his dominion, if we're to call it that. And furthermore, this royal rule is a responsibility, okay? Genesis 2:5 suggests that creation is incomplete without a human gardener. Let's take a quick look at that too. It says, now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth. And get this, there was no one to work the ground, okay? But then we read in verse 7, then, all right? Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground. So Adam represents a gardener king in that order, a king who lives off the land, but also nurtures it. And despite what some radical environmentalists might say, the earth would not be better off without humans. We are, in fact, created in the image of God to participate in his ongoing work of creation. We are meant to be more than conquerors or stewards, but we are co-creators and gardeners in a kingly sense. But as we know, things do not turn out well. Following the narrative, we see that sin enters the picture in Genesis 3. And whilst we can't cover it all, we know that our relationships change as a result of sin. As I said earlier, in our disobedience to God, our relationship with him is ruptured. The relationship between Adam and Eve is ruptured, between others, and of course, with ourselves and creation. They are ruptured. And what happens at the end is Adam and Eve are ultimately expelled from the garden. That's in Genesis 3:17. And as mentioned earlier, we see all of these ruptures expressed in East Asian pop culture and tradition. Now, usually when we focus on this text, we focus on the point that Adam and Eve were kicked out. But have you ever considered the passage from the point of view of the garden? If Adam's creation from the dust represented his enthronement as king, then God's pronouncement that to the dust you will return not only describes his mortality, but also his dethronement as king. In other words, creation has lost its royal gardeners. Tragedy. And perhaps that's why Paul writes in Romans 8 that the whole of creation is now groaning. What is it that they're groaning for? They're groaning for the return of the gardener king. In one of the scenes in Princess Mononoke, a dying nature god says to the humans, "The trees cry out as they die, but you cannot hear them." They too are groaning for the royal gardener. Now, the good news is this. Even though we may have abdicated our responsibility, as depicted through Adam and Eve, another gardener king has come into the world, and his name is Jesus. Now, let us now turn to John's Gospel. John's Gospel is helpful because John uses the Creation Week narrative, which we've been looking at, as his framework. I think someone mentioned this in the previous lecture. John 1:1, in the beginning, echoes Genesis 1:1. John 19:30, it is finished, echoes Genesis 2:2, it is finished, and so on. And what is particularly relevant in this scene, or is the scene where Mary Magdalene encounters Jesus the morning after he has risen from the dead. And in this passage, beginning in John 20, the place of old creation, symbolized by the empty tomb, gives way to new creation, symbolized by the garden. Let's read it, John 20, verse 11. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She says, "They've taken my Lord away. I don't know where they've put him." We talked earlier on about creation groaning for its gardener king. Here we have Mary groaning in the garden for her Lord. But let's carry on. As she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, she did not realize it was Jesus. And he asked the woman, "Why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Now, let's pay special attention to how John describes Mary's response. "Thinking he was the gardener," she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've put him and I'll get him." It says, thinking he was the gardener. Can you see what John is doing here? I've read this passage many times before, and I always assumed that Mary just got it wrong. But you see, Mary's misunderstanding is actually a deep comprehension of what has just happened. The man standing before her is the gardener, not a worker in the garden, but the gardener king of new creation, a king who lives in perfect harmony with creation, a king who embodies the ideals of East Asian theology of yin yang. Through his resurrection, the age to come is now breaking into our present age, breaking down the walls and dualistic thinking that divide us. This is the gardener that creation is groaning for. And this new reality has profound implications for those of us who claim to be Christians. As citizens of the kingdom of God, we too are called to participate in the ongoing creative and redemptive process. The reborn gardener of Genesis 2, Jesus, calls his subjects, the renewed humanity of Genesis 1, to embrace our identity as royal representatives, made in God's likeness, to be more, much more than conquerors, and dare I say it, stewards. Now, whilst there are many ways that we can engage with environmental issues, there is one I want to highlight today. If we understand and accept that to be made in God's image, we are to be royal gardeners, then it stands to reason that we tarnish that image when we prevent others from reflecting it too. And yet, how many farmers in poorer nations are forced to sell their produce to us for next to no profit as their countries struggle to pay off insurmountable debts? It strikes me as somewhat ironic that we try and use stewardship language in relation to the environment, when in actuality, the thing we are called to steward faithfully and generously is used to hold other nations to ransom. How many countries plunder the natural habitat to produce items that satisfy our demands in the West? We are made to be more than conquerors, and we are made to be more than consumers. So whether we choose to buy food more ethically, or whether we opt to buy things more sustainably, we are choosing to be co-creators with Christ. It is through him that creation can find its hope, and it's through him that his kingdom, his dominion, will reign. That is the good news we have to offer. So, in conclusion, really, I am convinced that the gardener king motif offers a superior theological approach to environmental issues than that espoused by proponents of stewardship. From a hermeneutical point of view, horticultural themes are woven throughout the whole of Scripture, culminating in the resurrected Christ in John's Gospel. And it's contended that this meta-narrative is considerably more convincing than any efforts to shoehorn royal themes under the heading of stewardship, which, as mentioned earlier, is never used in relation to creation. And this new language that we have removes any ambiguity that a term like stewardship suffers. In fact, agricultural imagery is more universal in appeal and application in a globalized world, where developing a common language across cultures is so crucial. And of course, East Asian theology, if you read it, is saturated with agricultural metaphors, which reflects a deep cultural sensitivity to the kinship between man and nature. Furthermore, the concept of stewardship can only really be grasped by those who have, as opposed to those who have not. The privilege of stewarding is predominantly reserved for those with power. So is it any wonder that concern for the environment has been described as a white middle-class concern? When I go along to these rallies, I don't really see many people from UKME or Global Majority Heritage present. They have other more pressing issues, immediate issues in their lives than being able to take a day off work to demonstrate. So embracing new language removes these barriers and can help draw humanity together to be one with each other, one with creation, and one people under God. Or as Wan Yang Ming puts it, to regard heaven and earth and the myriad things as one body. He regards the world as one family and the country as one person. So given that Lynn White Jr. expressly attacks Christianity in its Western form, I sense that East Asian theology might provide fresh perspectives. In fact, White himself is not wholly dismissive of Christianity. Towards the end of his article, he says, more science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. Incorporating East Asian theology will encourage the type of rethinking that White deems so necessary, in the same way that the theology from the global south has reinvigorated approaches to social justice. At the beginning of my presentation, I showed you a picture, didn't I, of Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa Tenzing Norgay, and how the newspapers in the West proclaimed man conquers mountain. Well, this incredible achievement did not go unnoticed in the East, but the newspapers there spoke very differently about their achievement. The newspapers in the East wrote, "Man befriends mountain." And my hope is that the church in the West will befriend and listen to voices in the East if we are to bridge divides and love earth. We need to welcome the contributions of the stranger. At the very beginning, I quickly shared that growing up in the West, I kind of suppressed my background in an effort to try and assimilate into the predominant Western Christian culture in which I was in. But I was unaware that deep within me, my heritage, God had deposited a richness. And my hope today for all of you listening, and those particularly here at OCMS, is that you would recognize the incredible deposits that God has put into you that I believe are crucial if we as the church global are going to help tackle climate change. Thank you.
Great, Mark. Stay there and we'll begin to ask questions. And for those who have joined online, if you will raise your hand by touching the bottom bar and it says reactions, and then you raise hands, and then we'll invite questions. And then here I will turn around and hand the mic off to you. Let me get things going. You've climbed into areas that I've spent a lot of time looking at, and one of the bridges that you seem to build, but I want to press you on this a little bit, is Wang Yangming is speaking from what many would view a non-theistic perspective. So if you go behind yin and yang, you get to the idea of wu and qi, all right? So what is the sense of the origins of things is described in the character wu, but wu is often translated as nothing, but it doesn't mean nothing. It just means that primordial sense. Qi is what extends out of that, and we see that in the phenomenal world. So here's my question. My question is, how do you bridge the non-theistic frameworks with the biblical account, which is deeply theistic in the sense of a God who speaks, of a God who refers to self as I will be whom I will be in his communication for Abraham? And does that have any implications both ways in terms of so much of the things that you brought out of a sense of oneness and creation and being a gardener, but also in terms of a theistic framework that sees God in relationship to a human being by a being who communicates to another who receives a word and then responds?
Gosh, that's a massive first question, isn't it? And just to preface it, in case I don't end up answering it as you're hoping, my locatedness is one where I am a diasporic Asian. And the reason I say that is that there are elements of my East Asian or my Chinese culture that are lost to me, that are out of sight. So in terms of how someone like me might marry those two opposites, I guess I look to the doctrine of the incarnation in the sense that where I cannot or where I struggle to reconcile those things academically, I realize, as I said at the start, that in this time in history, God has created communities like myself who are in that liminal space, drawing what they can in their reality from the East Asian heritage and marrying it to the news and the work of the Spirit that they get here. I don't mean it as a cop-out, because I wouldn't have the academic language, but what I have seen and experienced is that many East Asians of the diaspora seem these days to be pulling much from their East Asian cultural heritage, but the bits that are and have been made available to them, which I believe through the work of the Spirit. So for example, for myself, releasing me from the chains of internalized racism, of only ever seeing the West as being the only solution, but taking what I can to create new theology. And of course, theology is constantly changing and evolving. So unfortunately, I don't have an academic answer for that particular question, but that is how personally I begin to, I have peace bringing these parts of my heritage and marrying them to my experience of the gospel, of the Bible, and spirituality.
Thank you, Mark. Dan, I see your hand raised. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. That was really tremendous, and so much of what you said really resonated deeply with me and with the way that my thinking has developed over the years. I love the East Asian, the yin yang, the kind of relational approach to these things, and moving away from a dualism, and that is wonderful. Especially, you mentioned heaven and earth being seen as together. And so my question is that, I agree with the concept of everything you've said, but when we come to changing the theological language, again, I love this idea of, well, you mentioned kinship, and I was thinking, well, where do we go with that in terms of our task? But when you moved into royal gardener, then that gives humanity that task that was part of that commission right from the beginning. But the situation we're in today, where so much of humanity is so divorced from nearness to the earth, from actual gardening, from, we live in cities, we have careers which are completely, astrophysics, nothing whatsoever to do with gardens. So how does that language, if we try to bring that into our churches and our theology in the West, how do we make that applicable to where people are today? And I was just thinking of the word rule, back in Genesis. You can still look at Jesus in terms of how did he rule as servant king, and that's a bit broader. But when we talk about royal gardener, as much as I love it, it seems a bit narrow for people today.
Thank you for that question, Daniel. I think that's a question that's looking at the practicalities of how we can perhaps introduce some of these ideas and teachings to actually have a positive impact when our society seems so divorced from agriculture and so forth. Just two observations I might make is during the pandemic in this country, a lot of people returned to the soil. Our lives were disrupted to an extent that people's lives were changing. And I saw so many people trying to grow their own vegetables or being very aware of where their vegetables were sourced from. And so again, I sometimes think as a climate crisis impacts us, it will cause some people, it will shake their lives up enough that they will consider these things. They will look to their heritage and history. But the other part, and since it's we're looking at practicalities, is basically education. I work, as it was mentioned in my introduction, I work with a group that works with the government about combating anti-Asian racism. And the educational piece is about how do we get into the curriculum East Asian perspectives and East Asian history and East Asian culture. And my thought is, if we're trying to answer your question, is this type of teaching, this type of history, this type of culture, which I've shared, in our globalized world needs to be part of the education curriculum as well. And at that point, young people are then picking up new narratives and new ways to look at the world instead of relying on what has been quite a narrow worldview that's been presented in our schools. That's just maybe one or two practical ways we could go about joining these concepts with reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for that. I thought it was wonderful. It actually echoes some of my own thinking. I'm kind of reluctant to share because I'm sort of half working on a book project. But the issue of yin and yang, I think, is very interesting. And when I've talked about this in the past, I come at it more from Taoism rather than Confucianism, but we can argue about that. People say that's syncretistic, it's not from the gospel or whatever. But if you think about it more carefully, yin and yang, I mean, the Chinese characters come from the dark side of a hill and the sunny side of the hill, according to where the sun is shining. So in a sense, yin and yang concept is actually a codification of a natural theology. So to me, Tom asked a question about the theistic worldview and the Hebrew scriptures. If we accept that the Hebrew scriptures are written in a certain cultural context, and our current kind of Western dualistic nightmare is product of another cultural context, then we can, to me, I'm at complete liberty to say that a yin and yang approach to theology or creation care is coming from a third context. But it's only a codification of realities which we see all around us. For example, wave-particle duality. If you talk about wave-particle duality to a bunch of kids who are 12 years old at school, they'll throw you out because their physics is Newtonian.
Right.
If you go into the modern physics, everyone says, yeah, we know that, even though we don't understand it. So all we're doing in yin and yang, it's an ancient Chinese codification of a natural theology, in my opinion. So that to me is a no-brainer. We can do what we like with it. I think also this issue of, when you're talking about stewardship, I was kind of thinking, where's you going with this? Because I kind of like stewardship, but as you unpacked it, I saw where you're coming from. But to me, whether it be stewardship, and there are the verbs in Genesis are the same verbs used for taking care of the utensils in the temple in the Hebrew. So there is this issue of taking care, doing things tenderly, looking after things properly, which I'm okay with stewardship. But it also comes, there's a kind of parallel with talking about being the kingly gardener. And this is where the problem exists with Confucianism, with the ruler and the rules of the father and the son. Where those relationships are imbued with sin, they will break down and there'll be problems. And so if we try to be stewards, to kind of throw a red rag to a bull if you want, if we try to be stewards or kings, it's the nature of that stewardship, it's the nature of that kingship, which I think really defines whether we get it right or not. And of course, Christ is the perfect king. Right. So I think we can, to me, we can talk stewardship, but it doesn't mean dominion. It means behaving as God would towards his creation. And that's why we were created in his image. So in a sense, it's almost semantics. So I'll just leave that with you, Phil. Yeah.
And thanks for giving us a glimpse of what your book might be containing. I'm just thinking about that a second. Yeah, no, I appreciate those comments. Thank you. I'll come back on them in a second.
Yeah, well, my point is almost the same as Paul's appealing to natural theology. I was talking to somebody about leadership in African traditional context. And we agree that there is a huge overlap between those kind of leadership which lead by consensus and also the leadership in the New Testament. Because we see in Galatians, the pillars of the church are three people, Peter, James, and John. So sometimes we find these commonalities between indigenous cultures and something in the Bible. The other thing is that the Chinese word for righteousness is absolutely amazing, blow your mind off. The Chinese word of righteousness has a lamb at the top and a me below. So the lamb covers me. You know, it's a perfect word for talking about atonement, but it's there. You can't deny it's a fact. It's a real phenomenon. And so then the question, I come across this kind of problem as well. Does that mean these cultures, these Chinese cultures has canonical authority? We can't say that. But what we can say is echo something in the Bible. And so we go through the Bible to say, well, these elements in our culture alert us of what is already there, that which have not seen before in the Bible. So we derive the canonical authority in the Bible, but these cultural elements alert us and open our minds that it's there.
Yep.
So that in that sense, we can overcome the hermeneutical problem or canonical problem. Sorry, we're not talking so much about ecology. I talk about hermeneutics, canonicity, but that's the way that I try to reconcile some of my, my use of Chinese term for theology and how do I, justify my use of those terms. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think this pairing of questions now has triggered something in my mind, and I think they complement so beautifully. You're talking which has canonical superiority and all that stuff. Well, what I would say, picking up on the previous point as well, we have to introduce the intersection of social justice. So a lot has been written about how you can't separate ecological issues with those of social justice, with the way that things are working. And so I would say that we live in a world where, if you look at social justice, much of the wrong done against peoples has been perpetrated by historic Western and perhaps even ongoing today Western powers. And so that's why those particular legitimate, as you've put, words like stewardship or perspectives, whilst in a vacuum are legitimate and fine, in context of the brokenness of the world, they may not be suitable to help bring people together. And so that's why we need more voices and maybe even more stress on some particular perspectives at this moment in time to redress the historic social inequalities that lead to environmental problems.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, listening to this conversation, I'm real thinking that it seems we are struggling really with the issues of language. But before that, I was a bit intrigued with White's critique of the church. And of course, I haven't read his work, and I don't know really what solutions he offered. It would have been very interesting to know what solutions White offered. Mm. Yeah, but back to the issue of semantics here, really. First of all, I want to say, really, I like the idea of the gardener. I mean, from my context, I think it sends a very powerful message than the idea of the king, because I do know for sure, unless you connect that, of course, to Christ, I mean, we would have problems really understanding how a king would be a loyal servant to the environment and to people. Yeah, but I just wonder, now taking semantics as our problem, whether there will ever be an agreement really on the right kind of language to be used. But also then, given that the context from which you've come has had this tradition for long, would we draw on some good models or examples of what is happening practically, not academically, to say it is working? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I have real joy speaking to this, I guess. One of the stories in the Old Testament that helps me kind of address some of those questions is obviously the story of Babel, right? We have humanity trying to find that one language we're talking about. Is there one perfect language? They tried to create that one perfect language. It's insinuated in the text, but we read that they try and keep people incarcerated within the city walls, which surround the tower, because they're looking for uniformity of thought and everything, not really unity. And so God, in his grace, disrupts the human project of trying to find this perfect language. And in his solution, there are many languages. So in some ways, when it comes to trying to find the right words and language for this, I'm not convinced that there is a really good, perfect language, but actually God wants us to work through our differences to witness to the world what working together can look like. Again, I think, as I answered the previous question, I think a dualistic mindset, the way it's been corrupted, has led to the oppression of other people so that their voices can't be heard. So at this point in history, this is why there's a lot of post-colonial critique. But actually, we all need each other. If, Paul's theology of the body, we need every part, be it the West, white, black, Asian, brown. I think that's what God is trying to bring us together. And I believe that's part of a solution for this eco-crisis. And so it breaks my heart when I do see a lot of people who should be on the same side fighting about ways to tackle the environment, but we need a lot more dialogue and things. So that story of Babel helps me not try and find a perfect language or think one is over and above better than the other. Yep.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for your talk. I have a lot of thoughts running around in my head, but my context is Bangladesh, and you see the abuse of the environment by the Bangladeshis. The Bangladeshis abuse their land. they pollute the environment. Leather is a huge industry in Bangladesh. And so while I think theology, in a sense, Asian theology can have an impact, I don't see the practical, like, in a sense, I'm a practitioner, so it's what do you do with that? Because no matter what words you use, what definitions you have, at the end of the day, there's the abuse of power.
Mm.
It's all about power and who controls what resources in the community. And so, you talk about East Asian theology and what Western theology can learn from that, and there's a lot we can learn. But then at the end of the day, in the community, what is the practice, and where does the ideas for that practice, where do they come from? So that's kind of what's running around in my head.
Oh, thank you. Apologies. Yeah,
I hope that makes sense.
it does. I'll offer some reflections. Again, without trying to sound like I'm avoiding the question, but I think it comes back down to those great commandments that Jesus ultimately said, which is to love God and to love neighbor. And like you said, we can have all of these different lenses to look at and different solutions, but ultimately on the ground in community, if people are not loving thy neighbor as themselves, then the situation is always going to be corrupt. And so this is why, though, I think that no matter which way you come at these problems, isn't it interesting that it keeps drawing us back to the heart of the gospel, which is that self-sacrificial love personified in Christ. But no, thank you for spotting that is the issue, and that's why the church must find her voice.
Yes, I think along with that love for other, it's appreciation for diversity and what others bring. Not too far on in Genesis, it talks about Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. They're not farmers. You have the one who's raising flocks. You have another who's a worker in bronze, another with musical instruments, and so each are bringing, their own unique giftedness, and so it's a recognition of an appreciation for the other, but as you say, a love and desire for the other to realize themselves and for everyone to work together, cooperatively.
No, thank you. And I think, again, if you remember at the top of my talk, I shared from a personal point of view how, I'm on a journey of discovering that I have a voice that actually adds something positive to the conversation. But you're right, if we are not valuing or even allowing other groups to speak, then we end up in an echo chamber. And that has been my experience of the eco groups in the UK. We're beginning just to hear the same narrative. We're going round and round and not getting anywhere. So absolutely, that diversity is key. Thank you.
That's me again.
Hello.
Just thinking, it's quite common in this building to, I wouldn't say attack maybe, but scratch evangelicalism, and I'm all for that. And I've said many times in this building, the problem is theological. So when we talk about creation care, people say, well, what about the gospel? This old stuff. That's actually dualistic thinking. It's right there. And so this idea about, if you look at the symbol, which was at the beginning of the talk, the Taoist symbol, the two teardrops come together to make a whole. It's a circle. It's perfection, right? And so by embracing the other, not absorbing them, but by embracing them and recognizing their difference, celebrating and accepting it, we actually form perfection. And if you look at the thought of Emmanuel Levinas, he talks about accepting the other. And it's not a totalizing acceptance where I make you into myself, which is what we tried to do in colonialism as it suited us. It's about saying this person looks different from me, but I accept them for who they are, and together we will make something. And so Levinas talks about the ethical demand of the face. When somebody's face comes in front of you, that is an ethical demand. And so he says ethics comes before ontology. And so this embrace of the other, this acceptance of the other, this working together with the other is intensely biblical and common sense, and also fits together with your Taoist or Confucian symbol. And remember that in the middle of the black teardrop, there's a white drop. In the middle of the white teardrop, there's a black drop. So when you look at the other and you engage with the other, you actually see something of yourself, which is also another whole level of very powerful stuff.
No, thank you for those comments. And I think as we think about society and contemporary issues, I'm sensitive to the fact that at a certain moment there's a lot of sinophobia, so a lot of xenophobia against Chinese for all sorts of geopolitical reasons, and I won't go into those. But the fact of the matter remains is that most of the patents concerning new eco-energies and so forth are coming from China. Much of the leading research into how we can be carbon neutral and stuff is actually happening in China. And so again, I think it's so important that although we differ on so many other issues, it could be human rights or politics or surveillance or whatever it is, but we can't be at a place where we reject the other, because as I think most of us realize, the crisis we are in requires all nations really working together. But if, again, suspicion or rejection of the other is our prevalent narrative, then it does look bleak. We may not find those joined up solutions that a problem of this magnitude requires. Yep.
Well, thank you, Mark, and really fitting for OCMS to be bringing in different perspectives from a global diversity and that kind of thing. And I think, you just brought that together so well. So let's put our hands together and thank Mark for his excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you next week as we have another chapter in creation care. So with that, I will bid adieu. And again, thank you for a great presentation.